We're going to move in a slightly different direction, and this is facing into the specific needs of our veterans, and in particular, the caregivers of our veterans. This is a topic that has just recently caught our attention, and our next speaker is going to address this. So Rajeev Ramchand is the co-director of the Rand Epstein Family Veterans Policy Research Institute. He's a senior behavioral scientist at Rand and a professor of policy analysis at Pardee Rand Graduate School. He holds a PhD in psychiatric epidemiology from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and a BA in economics from the University of Chicago. He has published over 150 peer-reviewed journal articles, reports, book chapters, and commentary. And in 2022, he was appointed to the Secretary of Defense by the Secretary of Defense to serve as a member of the Department of Defense Suicide Prevention and Response Independent Review Committee. Rajeev visited this center this past summer. He met with a group of us and our caregivers as he was completing his on-the-ground research phase for the Rand report titled America's Military and Veteran Caregivers, Hidden Heroes Emerging from the Shadows. And this report was published in September, and in front of you is a card that has an access to that report. If you would like to download it, I will tell you it is fascinating. It is data rich. And so it is my pleasure to introduce Rajeev Ramchand. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tim. I wrote that, I hope everyone can hear me. I wrote that that bio for our website, yet every time I hear it, it's a little embarrassing. Can you all see my slides? Awesome. Well, thanks so much. And I'm just so inspired to be with you all today. Tim and Kathy and Kendall were just such amazing hosts when I visited them earlier as we were working on this research. And we still have some more research and some of the insights I learned that is forthcoming. And some of the insights I learned from my visit to Mercy will be highlighted in that work. But I want to give you a preface of where we're going. And I don't have much time and I have a lot of information to get through. So I'm going to just move to the next slide. So you're all here talking about caregivers, so I don't have to remind you of what caregivers do. But they manage and they help individuals in very profound ways. We describe it here. The reason I want to share this with you all is because most research studies on military and veteran caregivers have asked a question that equates to, are you a caregiver? It's usually, do you provide care and assistance for somebody who's ill or injured or wounded to help manage their conditions? And it's very kind of open-ended. In our study, we fielded a national survey of the US population, and we asked, have you done any of these things in the past 30 days? So we asked specific questions. Have you helped somebody get into and out of beds or chairs? Have you helped people bathing, dressing? And importantly, for those of us who care for individuals with memory challenges or mental health challenges, at the bottom, we asked, have you helped people manage their mood, or have you helped people remember things? Next slide. Using that data, we estimate that there's 105.6 military US adults who are currently caregiving to other adults. That's 40.5% of the US population. That's much larger than past estimates of caregiving, and we attribute that the number is really due to the way that we ask the question, because as you all know, many people don't identify themselves as caregivers. Next slide, please. What I want to talk to you today is the focus of our research, which was among that group, those hundreds of millions of caregivers, 14.3 are currently caring for somebody who's wounded, ill, or injured, who currently serves or previously served in the US military. Next slide. We identified through our research 9 ways to support who we call hidden heroes It's a term we came up with because we really believe that our military and veteran caregivers are the backbones to really our national security. Next slide. The first is to increase opportunities to provide financial compensation to caregivers for the work that they perform. Next slide. So these are the hours of the time military and veteran caregivers spend caring for their loved ones. And you'll see at the far end of it, around 10% of those caregivers are spending over 40 hours per week providing care. So it's the equivalent of a full-time job. Next slide. But we know that caregiving comes at a cost. So we estimate that military and veteran caregivers on average spend $8,583 per year on out-of-pocket expenses associated with caregiving. And we also estimate that due to work disruptions or school disruptions, they're losing around $4,500 per year in income loss. So that's a total of around $13,100 in income that they don't have that could be attributed to caregiving. Yet, if we paid them for all of the hours that they spend providing care, the value to the US society would be between $119 and $485 billion. And that's a huge range, but that range really is attributed to the different work that caregivers do. So some of the work that they do would command the minimum wage, like taking an individual to a hospital appointment or a medical appointment. But some of the tasks caregivers do, like administering oxygen or a feeding tube, those are things that can only be done by registered nurses in the home. So that would command a nursing's wage. And that's why we have such a wide range of estimates. Next slide. But compounded upon this is that our military and veteran caregivers, a lot of them are struggling financially. 35% of them are at or below 130% of the federal poverty level. And that's the threshold that's really used to determine whether they're eligible for state level benefits. We also find that depending on the age of the person they're caring for, many of them report difficulty paying bills. Many of them have no rainy day funds, so that's money set aside in case of an emergency. Between 22 and 40% meet criteria for food insecurity. And among those who are food insecure, only around a quarter to a third are accessing SNAP benefits, which is the entitlement program for those who have constrained means and meet food insecurity requirements. Next slide. Our second and I should say in our report, when we talk about these recommendations, we have very specific details on the ways that we think that we can increase financial assistance. And so, for example, I'm not going to go through all of them because there's so many and I have limited time. But for that one, for example, we recommend two things. First, we recommend that programs that serve caregivers help them identify and apply for the benefit and entitlement programs they may be eligible for. But we also call upon our policymakers to continue exploring caregiving tax credits for caregivers. We know that earned income tax credit, as well as the expansion of the child tax credit during COVID, are estimated to have lifted millions of households out of poverty. And we hope that a caregiver tax credit could do something similarly for our military and veteran caregivers. So that's just an example of the specificity that we have for all these recommendations. So the second recommendation we have is to increase access to mental health and substance use treatment for caregivers and their children. Next slide. We find really startling statistics that the orange is non-caregivers, the blue is military and veteran caregivers who are caring for somebody over 60, and the green rather, is those who are caring for somebody under the age of 60. And what we find is that those who are caring for those under the age of 60, and I'll speak more about them in a bit, around 43% of those caregivers meet criteria for depression relative to non-caregivers. So it's around 4 times the rate of non-caregivers. We also see that around 1 in 5 of those caregivers have themselves had thoughts of taking their own lives in the past year. And that's, again, around 4 times what we see in the general population. Next slide. We also see needs among our children in caregiving households. So if you look on the right-hand side, these are children in caregiving households, military and veteran caregiving households. Around a quarter of these children had seen a mental health care provider in the past year. But more interesting is that next at the bottom, around 24% of them, so around a quarter of them, of these caregivers reported that they believe that their kids needed mental health treatment in the past year, but didn't receive it. So there are obviously some unmet needs, even from the perspective of caregivers themselves. Next slide. Our third recommendation is to tailor caregiver support programs to reflect the diversity of caregivers. Next slide. Probably any of you who've worked with caregivers, who's been a caregivers, will probably resonate with this quote. I'm just going to read the green part. Anyone who's a caregiver will tell you the same thing. We all have the same experiences, but we all have very different experiences. And this is from our interviews with caregivers we conducted in addition to our survey with over 1,000 representatives. We spoke to in depth to around 40 caregivers, military and veteran caregivers. Next slide. So this gives you a sense of that diversity. So I mentioned before these caregivers who are caring for somebody under the age of 60. We see that around 25% of them in the top hand are spouses, another 25% are neighbors and friends, and then surprisingly 31% are other relatives. So they're siblings who are taking on these responsibilities, they're nieces and nephews, uncles and aunts, so people who are kind of not traditionally thought of as caregivers. And that's really different than our caregivers who are caring for those who are over 60. So that's our traditional notion of caregiving that we think of. These are children or grandchildren who are taking care of their parents or grandparents. It's still a quarter spouses, and we still have a lot of friends and neighbors and non-relatives taking on these responsibilities. So that's one area that they're diverse. Next slide. They also differ in the types of conditions that they're caring for. And I want to highlight 4 of them in specific. So the ones that are more common among our older caregivers or our older care recipients are things like vision and hearing. That's that second bar down. We see that 68% of military caregivers to those over 60 reported that the person they're caring for has vision or hearing difficulties or diagnosed with a vision or hearing. And then the third one down is neurological conditions. So these are things like dementia or stroke or other things. And we see that 37% of caregivers, military and veteran caregivers, are caring for someone with these diagnoses. In comparison, we see much higher rates of things like traumatic brain injury among those who are caring for individuals 60 or older. So 21% of those caregivers are caring for somebody with a traumatic brain injury. And then at the second to last at the bottom is really striking. We see around 2/3 of our military and veteran caregivers to those under the age of 60 are caring for somebody who's been diagnosed with a mental health condition or substance use disorder. Next slide. Our fourth recommendation is to expand and promote home health care, considering the ways in which caregivers will be affected. And I heard the last speaker a little bit speaking about nursing homes, and this somewhat gets to this issue. And it's really this movement that we see in the United States more generally to community care, to enable people to be cared for in their homes and really to age in place. And what we see is that 53% of military and veteran caregivers used home health services in the past 2 years. But it's not equivalent across all caregivers. And in particular, we see spouse caregivers are much less likely to access home health care services than other caregivers. But we also see that those who use the services reported less caregiver burden. So it's a really promising finding that those who used home health care services have less burden. And we can't say that that's causally related. We can't say one caused the other, but it's promising. At the same time, next slide, we really want to be careful that as we think about the expansion of home healthcare services, that we're considering the role of the caregiver and the onus and burden upon the caregiver. So what we're asking is, well, will this home healthcare service create additional caregiving tasks? The answer is almost always yes, because now you have to manage someone coming into the home. You have to manage their schedules. You have to decide how you're going to hire them, how you're going to ensure that they're providing adequate and high quality care to your loved one. Will it create additional out-of-pocket expenses? So these are things like retrofitting bathrooms or hallways, for example. And then finally, will it create additional work, school, and family disruptions? Home healthcare assistants are people, and people get sick, and people have emergencies. And so when the person can no longer come into the home, does that disrupt your travel schedule as a caregiver or your work schedule? So we have to be thinking and planning for these, I don't want to say unintended consequences of care for at home. These are quite reasonable things to be considering, and ensuring that we have provisions in place to manage these. Next slide. The fifth is focused programmatic and social support within the context of local conditions in which caregivers live. And honestly, this is just the adage, but it's that rising boat saves all, or whatever, that rising waters lifts all boats, or something like that. And basically what the point is that caregivers live in communities. And so if we support these communities, we can support caregivers, even if we're not providing services direct and specifically towards the caregiving community. So next slide. I just want to highlight to you where caregivers are living. So in our survey, we took everyone who responded and we matched them to the counties in which they lived. And then we described characteristics of those counties. And these differences may seem small, but they're actually really quite significant. So we see our military and veteran caregivers, regardless who they're caring for, tend to live in lower resource communities. So on average, they live in communities where 11% of households live below poverty, 4% of adults are unemployed, and the median income is substantially lower than among non-caregivers. We also see that the opportunities are less. And this Child Opportunity Index is this composite measure of essentially all the resources in a community. So how many parks they have, how many healthcare facilities they have, whether there's concerns about lead or noise pollution. So it's just kind of looking at all opportunities. And we see that military and veteran caregivers tend to live in an area. It goes from 0 to 100, tend to live in neighborhoods with fewer and fewer resources. Next slide. The sixth is encourage healthcare systems to better integrate caregivers into healthcare teams. So we asked caregivers about the place where they most often went to seek care for their care recipient, for their loved one. And we asked whether they experienced a series of things. And you can see here that they don't always feel included in healthcare decisions. So only around 14% of caregivers at the bottom reported that they frequently communicated with their providers. The most was around a third reported that providers sought their input. Only a third said that providers listened to them. Only a quarter said that they had helpful interactions with providers, and 22%, only 22% said that caregivers ever inquired about their own needs as caregivers. So definitely some room to grow in terms of inclusivity. And I'll tell you, just because you all are within a healthcare system, some of our specific recommendations here, they're really twofold. And they're really not so much about encouraging healthcare systems to do these things out of the goodness of their hearts, but also trying to incentivize them to do that. And what we mean by that, quite frankly, is to describe and to document and demonstrate the value that these things have. So we call upon research to really identify, what are our outcomes when we do these things? Do we have less frequent readmissions to the hospital, less ER visits? Do we have really better volume? Is there a demand shift? Are people more likely to come to one facility than another because it gets a reputation of being inclusive? So that's one area. But then we also call upon the continued creation of new, honestly, CPT codes and other reimbursement strategies to really incentivize providers to do these things, because we know that there's a lot of responsibilities on them. And when they have a CPT code associated with those minutes that they spend doing these things, it can really influence behaviors. Next slide. Oh, I thought this was a really interesting quote. When I started using their terminology, that was respected. I had to do a little bit of reading and research, and then it's like I taught myself, let's try it this way. Let's use their terminology. And when I did, then I got the respect from them where they would talk to me. And this is a really common caregiver story. In fact, Kathy, I'm reminded of your book. And I think my world wore a bow tie. I just have it right here in front of me. It reminded me of your book. And I think that you put a lot of effort into learning yourself when you were going through your caregiving journey, and becoming an expert in your husband's condition. And I think that a lot of caregivers find that that's the way that gains the respect. Whether they should need to go through that is a question that we can ask, I suppose. Next slide. I realize I only have 1 minute left, so I'm going to go quickly. Promote work environments that are supportive of caregivers. Next slide. This is just highlighting what you said before, what we said before about the income loss associated with caregiving. You can see that 16% of caregivers have had to cut back work hours, quit school early. Some of them experienced perceived workplace discrimination. And I have to say that third one can actually kind of come from a quote unquote a good place. If supervisors say, for example, Scott saying we're fine on time. Okay, good. For example, if a boss or a supervisor tells someone, or makes a decision that I'm not going to promote them or give them this added responsibility because they're caregiving at home and are doing so much that I don't want to burden them with this other thing. So it could be, coming from a good place, but it actually is discrimination. It could be, hindering the opportunities for job growth or benefits for caregivers. Next slide. Just two more. The eighth, and maybe we all have time for questions. Conduct rigorous evaluations of initiatives designed to support military and veteran caregivers. Next slide. So we see that many caregivers participate in these types of programs, in-person support groups, online support groups, respite. These percentages show among those military and veteran caregivers who participate in these things, those who still meet criteria for excessive burden. Now that could be interpreted two ways. This could be that those who have the greatest need, who are the most burdened, are the ones who are using these services. And that's great. That's who we want to be using the services. But it could also be meaning that these services aren't reducing caregiver burden. And maybe that's not their intent. Maybe that's not what they're supposed to do. But it's still shocking, and we should be evaluating these programs and really elevating the ones that we see are actually having a demonstrable impact in reducing caregiver burden and are really helpful to caregivers beyond just anecdote. Next slide. And then finally, continue to conduct research that fully captures the breadth of caregiving those who serve as caregivers. Next slide. So there's tons of areas for research. There's tons of opportunities. The ones that I'm most passionate about, especially for our military and veteran caregivers, are that we asked about a series of tasks that caregivers do. And the ones that were most frequently reported were the following: remembering what the care recipient should be doing, so those cognitive tasks that I talked about earlier. And the second, coping with stressful situations or avoiding triggers of anxiety of antisocial behavior. So these are helping people with mental health conditions or substance use disorders. What I think is important to note is that neither of these things are listed as activities of daily living or instrumental activities of daily living, ADLs and IADLs. Why I think that's a problem is because we often tie ADL and IADL tasks to eligibility for a lot of caregiver programs. And so if we're tying it to those caregiver programs, then we're excluding a series of military and veteran caregivers who may not be helping with those things, but are nonetheless caregivers themselves. And I think research is really needed to go beyond these two questions and really start to articulate what individuals are doing who are caring for people with cognitive decline, mental health conditions, mood disorders, anxiety disorders, as well as substance use disorders. And the next slide really hits that point home. And this is a quote from a caregiver: "Here at home, I have to have all his medications locked up in a safe because he has tried to take his life before. And one of the things he has done that with is medications. My biggest challenge is to make sure that he doesn't try to take his own life again. How can we not consider this person a caregiver, and how can we not support them?" Next slide. As you mentioned, all of this information are in these reports. The top three are the original research reports that are really in depth and long and detailed. The bottom three are just simple overviews. You can access them all at the same place. So if you don't feel like reading a 300-page report, you can read, a 10-page, very visual representation of the research and a lot of what I've shared with you today. So please, we tried to make it accessible to everyone. Next slide. This is my team, and it really does take a village to put forth all this work. And I just want to acknowledge all the people at RAND who helped put this together. Next slide. And then finally, I want to acknowledge, Senator Elizabeth Dole started the Elizabeth Dole Foundation. They were the funders of this research, and just so grateful for Senator Dole to shining a light on this population. And the other woman you see in that picture is my mother, because during doing this research, my mother was herself diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia, and so I've had to assume the role, along with my brothers and my in-laws, of being her caregiver as well. And it's really just in her to respect her that this research really resonates with me more so than it has ever done before, just because of my own personal caregiving journey. So I'm really passionate about this cause, and thank you all for turning attention to it and shining light and inviting me to be with you today. So thank you.